Welcome to the video on analysing a dataset using a multiple regression. We'll guide you on the steps to running a multiple regression through SPSS. So let's take a quick recap of the research question we're working through. Our researcher is interested in whether perceived levels of stress can be predicted by these three variables here: perceived control of internal states, mastery, and social desirability. But before we go into our data set to run a multiple regression, we need to pre-screen our data for these assumptions of multiple regression. All of these assumptions can be tested through SPSS at the same time as running your regression. Lucky for us, or we would be doing a lot of analyses. So independence of errors can be checked through the Durbin-Watson analysis. Outliers will be assessed through case-wide diagnostics, Cook's and Mahalanobis distances. To detect for multicollinearity, we're going to be looking at tolerance and VIF values. And lastly, to look at normality, linearity, and homoscedasticity of residuals, we can do visual inspections using histogram and scatter plots. So let's get to it. Let's open up the file associated with this activity if you don't have it open yet. To run a standard multiple regression, you go to Analyze, Regression, and Linear. In this window, we need to tell SPSS what our dependent and independent variables are, or in other words, our outcome variable and our predictor variables. Let's start off with our outcome variable or dependent variable. We're trying to predict perceived stress levels, so this makes it our dependent variable. Let's select this variable and transfer it into the dependent box. Now, we're using total mastery, social desirability, and perceived control of internal states in order to predict perceived stress levels. So we need to transfer all three variables into the independent box. So doing this, we've just told SPSS what we're trying to predict, as well as the variables used to predict it. We need to tell SPSS what options to use when constructing the regression model, and we still need to test for the assumptions of the multiple regression. So let's click on Statistics, and we want to place a tick next to Estimates, Confidence Intervals. These need to be reported when writing up your results. We also need to ensure we place a tick next to Model Fit, Descriptives for our table of means and standard deviations for all our variables. We also want part and partial correlations because this will tell us how much variability is uniquely accounted for by each variable. We also want to place a tick next to collinearity diagnostics. This is necessary because this will be necessary to determine multicollinearity effects. Let's also place a tick next to Durbin-Watson on SPSS so we can actually assess for independence of errors. And finally, with case-wise diagnostics, we want to change our outlier settings. Make sure that the number 2 is typed in our standard deviations box. This will help us to determine whether we have any outliers amongst our residual or error terms. Let's click Continue. Alright, we're not quite done yet. What we want to do now is to go into Plots. So click the Plots button. This option will allow us to examine the assumption of random errors and homoscedasticity. We need to make a scatter plot of our standardized residuals against our standardized predicted values. So let's select Z-Resid, and we're going to transfer this into our Y-axis box. And what we want to do now is select Z-Pred. This represents our standardized predicted values. We want to transfer this into our X-axis box. Now, to check for the assumption that residuals are normally distributed, we place a tick next to histogram and normality probability plot. We also want to place a tick next to produce all partial plots. We do this in order to examine whether the relationship between each predictor variable and dependent variable is linear, and it also helps us to further look at homoscedasticity. Let's click Continue. we still have one more thing to do. Let's click on Save, because we need to select 2 more options. Now, the options that you select will be determined by the context of the research and data, but for this exercise, we'll just be using the most basic options. And these are Mahalanobis and Cook's. We need to select these 2 options to determine whether we have multivariate outliers and overly influential cases. Let's press continue and OK. And there we have it. We have our analysis of our multiple regression, as well as all the assumptions associated with running this multiple regression. It's really important now that you save this output file so we can go through it in detail at a later time. Thanks for watching the data analysis video of a multiple regression. You should now be able to run a multiple regression with assumptions associated.